The morning sun streamed through the large windows of Sullivan's barbershop, illuminating the carefully arranged tools of Thomas Sullivan's trade. At 29, Tom had spent the better part of a decade perfecting his craft, transforming a humble frontier barbershop into Cedar Ridge's gathering place for civilized conversation and skilled grooming. Cedar Ridge had grown from a rough mining camp into a prosperous town of nearly 2,000 souls, thanks to the silver mines of the surrounding mountains and the railroad spur that connected them to larger markets. With prosperity came demands for refinement that Tom was uniquely qualified to provide. His shop reflected both practical necessity and artistic sensibility. Gleaming scissors and razors arranged with precision, leather chairs worn smooth by countless customers, and walls decorated with illustrations from Eastern fashion magazines that showed the latest styles in men's grooming. Tom took pride in offering services that rivaled anything available in Denver or San Francisco. "Morning, Tom," called out Sheriff Mackenzie, settling into the familiar comfort Tom's chair for his weekly shave and trim. "Heard tell there's some fancy folks staying at the Territorial Hotel. Eastern people with more money than sense, from what Mrs. Peterson says." Tom lathered the sheriff's face with practiced efficiency, his movements smooth and confident after years of handling sharp implements near important anatomy. "Travelers come through regular enough, Sheriff. Mining business brings all sorts to Cedar Ridge these days. These ones are different, though, lady and her companion, traveling with enough luggage for a small army. They've taken the hotel's finest suite and haven't shown much interest in the usual tourist attractions." Tom focused on his work, drawing the razor carefully along the sheriff's jawline while listening to the morning's gossip. Cedar Ridge remained small enough that strangers generated considerable curiosity, especially wealthy strangers who deviated from predictable patterns. "Word is the lady's been asking about local services," Sheriff Mackenzie continued. "Quality services, not the usual frontier necessities. Mrs. Peterson thinks she might be considering investment opportunities, maybe opening some kind of fancy establishment." The conversation was interrupted by the gentle chime of the shop's doorbell, announcing a customer who made both men look up with obvious surprise. The young woman who entered was dressed in traveling clothes that spoke of Eastern sophistication, a deep blue dress with subtle but expensive details, a hat that managed to be both practical and elegant, and gloves that suggested hands unaccustomed to rough work. But what struck Tom immediately was her bearing. She moved with the confident grace of someone educated and refined, yet her eyes held intelligence and directness that suggested substance beneath the fashionable exterior. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the cultured accent of Eastern cities. "I apologize for interrupting, but I was hoping to speak with the proprietor about services for my traveling companion." Tom wiped his hands carefully before approaching her. "I'm Tom Sullivan, ma'am. How can I assist you?" The woman studied him with obvious approval, taking in his clean appearance, professional demeanor, and the obvious quality of his shop's appointments. "I'm Miss Elizabeth, and I'm traveling with an elderly gentleman who requires regular grooming services. Unfortunately, he's quite particular about such matters and tends to be difficult with unfamiliar providers." Tom noticed a slight hesitation before she provided her name, along with other small details that suggested careful consideration of her words. But frontier courtesy demanded that he accept her explanation without prying into personal matters. "I'd be happy to discuss arrangements, Miss Elizabeth. What kind of services does your companion require?" "Regular hair trimming and shaving, primarily. He's quite elderly and sometimes becomes confused or agitated, so patience and gentleness are essential qualities in anyone who works with him." Tom glanced at Sheriff Mackenzie, who was listening with obvious interest to this unusual request. Elderly travelers requiring special care weren't uncommon, but something about Miss Elizabeth's explanation felt carefully rehearsed. "I'm experienced with customers who require extra consideration," Tom assured her. "Age and infirmity demand patience, and I pride myself on providing comfortable service regardless of special circumstances." Miss Elizabeth's smile was genuine and warm. "Excellent. Would it be possible for you to visit our hotel? Mr. Whitman becomes quite distressed when removed from familiar surroundings, and I fear the journey to your establishment might prove too taxing for his constitution." The request for house calls was unusual but not unprecedented. Tom occasionally provided services to prominent citizens who preferred privacy or convenience over the social atmosphere of his shop. "Certainly, ma'am. I can arrange a visit this afternoon, if that would be suitable." "That would be perfect. We're staying in the Territorial Hotel suite. Shall we say 2 o'clock?" After Miss Elizabeth left with arrangements confirmed, Sheriff Mackenzie's curiosity got the better of his discretion. "Interesting young lady, Tom. Something familiar about her, though I can't place what." Tom was thinking the same thing, though he attributed it to the general impression of refinement that marked people from established Eastern families. Miss Elizabeth possessed a kind of polish that came from generations of education and privilege, making her stand out noticeably in frontier communities. That afternoon, Tom gathered his portable kit and walked to the Territorial Hotel, Cedar Ridge's finest accommodation and a symbol of the town's growing prosperity. The building's lobby reflected aspirations toward Eastern sophistication: Persian rugs, mahogany furniture, and crystal chandeliers that proclaimed Cedar Ridge's emergence from rough frontier settlement to civilized community. Miss Elizabeth met him in the lobby, her afternoon dress different from her morning attire, but equally elegant. She led him to the hotel's most expensive suite, a collection of rooms that indeed suggested travelers of considerable means. "Mr. Whitman is resting in the bedroom," she explained quietly. "He tends to be more cooperative in the afternoon, when his mind is clearest." But when Tom entered the bedroom, he found it empty except for furniture and personal belongings that obviously belonged to Miss Elizabeth rather than an elderly male companion. The confusion must have shown on his face, because she looked genuinely embarrassed. "I'm afraid I haven't been entirely truthful with you, Mr. Sullivan," she admitted. "There is no Mr. Whitman. I'm the one who requires barbering services." Tom stared at her, trying to understand why an elegantly dressed young lady would need the services of a barber rather than seeking appropriate feminine grooming at one of Cedar Ridge's establishments that catered to women. "I don't understand, Miss Elizabeth. Ladies typically prefer—" "I have my reasons," she interrupted, her voice carrying a note of desperation that made Tom's protective instincts stir. "Please, I'll pay whatever you think fair, but I need someone skilled with scissors and razors who could be discreet about unusual requests." Tom studied her face, noting signs of genuine distress beneath her composed exterior. Whatever Miss Elizabeth's reason for deception, they stemmed from necessity rather than casual dishonesty. "What kind of services do you need?" he asked carefully. "Hair trimming, primarily. Nothing dramatic, just maintenance of a style that requires regular attention." She gestured toward her elaborately arranged hair. "I've been traveling for months, and it's becoming difficult to manage without professional assistance." Tom began to understand. Ladies' hairstyles of the period required considerable skill to maintain, and frontier communities often lacked women with the training necessary for complex arrangements. A skilled barber might indeed be the only person capable of providing the services she needed. "I can certainly help with hair trimming and styling," Tom said, "though I should mention that my experience is primarily with gentlemen's styles." Miss Elizabeth's relief was obvious. "That's perfectly acceptable. I'm less concerned with fashion than with practicality." As Tom worked carefully to trim and reshape her dark blonde hair, he found himself drawn into conversation that revealed Miss Elizabeth to be remarkably well-educated and genuinely interested in his thoughts about everything from local politics to his artistic aspirations. "You mentioned aspirations beyond barbering," she observed as he worked. "What dreams do you harbor for your future?" Tom was surprised by her directness and his own willingness to share ambitions he rarely discussed. "I've always been interested in sculpture, actually. Working with clay and stone appeals to me in ways similar to precision required for barbering." "Have you had opportunity to pursue such interests?" "Some. Cedar Ridge isn't exactly a center for artistic instruction, but I've been experimenting with local materials and techniques I've read about in books." Miss Elizabeth's questions revealed genuine curiosity about his life and work, making the grooming session feel more like an engaging conversation between equals than a simple business transaction. When Tom finished his work, she studied her reflection with obvious satisfaction. "Excellent work, Mr. Sullivan. Would it be possible to arrange regular appointments? Perhaps weekly sessions to maintain the style." Tom agreed to weekly visits, though he remained puzzled by the mysterious circumstances surrounding Miss Elizabeth's need for his services. As he gathered his tools and prepared to leave, she stopped him with a question that revealed more than she probably intended. "Mr. Sullivan, in your experience, do people in Cedar Ridge tend to accept others based on their character, or do social expectations and backgrounds carry more weight in determining relationships?" The question suggested someone struggling with issues of identity and acceptance, concerns that seemed disproportionate for a simple traveler seeking grooming services. "Character matters most on Frontier," Tom replied honestly. "People here tend to judge by actions rather than origins, since most of us came west to build something new rather than rely on whatever we left behind." Miss Elizabeth's smile was wistful and grateful. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. I'll see you next week." As Tom walked back to his shop, he reflected on the unusual appointment and the intriguing woman who'd requested his services. Miss Elizabeth possessed refinement and education that marked her as someone from a privileged background, but her question suggested someone seeking something beyond the comfort of wealth and social position. Whatever brought her to Cedar Ridge, Tom found himself looking forward to their next appointment and the opportunity to continue conversations that challenged his mind while engaging his heart in ways he hadn't expected. Over the following weeks, Tom's Tuesday afternoon appointments with Miss Elizabeth became the highlight of his routine. What had begun as unusual barbering services evolved into sessions he anticipated with growing pleasure, their conversations ranging across subjects that revealed both her extensive education and his natural intelligence. "You've been reading Emerson," Miss Elizabeth observed during their third meeting, noting the book of essays Tom had mentioned. "What do you think of his views on self-reliance?" Tom considered the question, while carefully trimming sections of her hair that had grown uneven during the week. "I appreciate his emphasis on individual judgment over social conformity. Out here, a person's work gets measured by what they can do rather than where they came from. And do you think that's always fair? Sometimes circumstances of birth provide advantages that create opportunities for achievement." "True enough," Tom agreed. "But I've noticed that advantages don't guarantee character, and lack of privilege doesn't prevent it. Some of the finest people I know started with nothing but determination." Miss Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, seemingly lost in thought. "You speak as someone who's given considerable thought to questions of worth and merit. Frontier life encourages such thinking. When survival depends on competence rather than connections, you learn to evaluate people differently than society folks might." Their conversations revealed Miss Elizabeth to be remarkably knowledgeable about literature, politics, and current events, while her questions about his life and aspirations showed genuine interest in understanding his perspective on everything from artistic expression to social responsibility. Tom found himself sharing ambitions and thoughts he'd rarely discuss with anyone, encouraged by her intelligent responses and obvious respect for his opinions. She possessed the rare gift of making him feel that his ideas mattered, regardless of the difference in their apparent social positions. "Have you had opportunity to work with sculpture since our last meeting?" she asked during their fourth appointment. "Some. I've been experimenting with local clay, trying to capture the character of people rather than just their physical appearance." Tom hesitated before continuing. "I've actually been working on a piece inspired by our conversations." "Really? I'd be honored to see it, if you'd be comfortable sharing your work." Tom was surprised by his willingness to show artistic efforts to someone whose opinion he'd come to value highly. "It's rough work, but I'll bring it next week if you're genuinely interested." "I'm very interested. Art that captures character sounds much more valuable than simple representation." As their meetings continued, Tom began noticing details that suggested Miss Elizabeth's story contained significant omissions. Her clothes, while practical for frontier travel, were of exceptional quality. Her hands, despite claims of traveling hardship, remained soft and well cared for. Most telling were her casual references to places and experiences that suggested familiarity with wealth and privilege far beyond what a traveling lady's companion would typically possess. "Have you spent much time in New York?" Tom asked during their fifth meeting, after she'd mentioned several specific details about the city's cultural institutions. Miss Elizabeth paused almost imperceptibly before answering. "Some. My previous employment occasionally required travel to major cities. Employment as a companion must offer interesting opportunities to see different places." "Yes, quite varied experiences," she replied, but her tone suggested reluctance to elaborate on specifics. Tom recognized the careful deflection and respected her obvious desire for privacy, though his curiosity about her background continued growing. Whatever Miss Elizabeth's real circumstances, she had reasons for maintaining her deception that seemed important to her sense of safety or independence. During their sixth meeting, Tom brought the small clay sculpture he'd been working on, a figure that captured not specific features, but the essence of intelligence, grace, and hidden sadness he'd observed in Miss Elizabeth during their conversations. Her reaction was immediate and deeply moved. "Tom, this is extraordinary. You've captured something I'm not sure I even recognize about myself. You have a quality of thoughtfulness that suggests someone carrying burdens beyond what most people face," Tom observed. "I try to show that complexity rather than just surface appearance." Miss Elizabeth studied the sculpture with obvious emotion. "You see me more clearly than people who've known me my entire life." The admission revealed more than she'd probably intended, confirming Tom's growing suspicion that Miss Elizabeth was hiding significant aspects of her identity and background. "Sometimes strangers see us more clearly than familiar people do," Tom said gently, "especially when they're looking without expectations or assumptions." "Is that how you see me? Without assumptions?" Tom met her eyes directly. "I see someone intelligent, kind, and genuine who seems to be seeking something she hasn't found yet. Beyond that, I try not to assume anything about circumstances you haven't chosen to share." Miss Elizabeth's smile was grateful and wistful. "Thank you for that. I've discovered that being seen for who you are rather than what you represent is rarer than I'd hoped." Their conversations during subsequent meetings grew increasingly personal, though Miss Elizabeth maintained careful boundaries around specific details of her background. Tom found himself falling in love with her mind, her character, and her response to ideas and experiences that revealed depth beneath her refined exterior. "What drew you to Cedar Ridge?" Tom asked during their 8th meeting. "Most travelers with your obvious education and refinement tend toward larger cities with more cultural amenities. I've been seeking something that larger cities couldn't provide," Miss Elizabeth replied thoughtfully. "Authenticity, perhaps? Places where people value substance over style, where conversations focus on ideas rather than social positioning. And have you found what you were seeking?" Miss Elizabeth looked at him with an expression that made Tom's heart race with hope and possibility. "More than I dared expect. I've found someone who treats me as an equal in conversation, who respects my thoughts, and who creates beauty from simple materials through skill and vision." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross, though both recognized the growing feelings that made their weekly meetings increasingly precious. "Elizabeth," Tom said softly, using her name with new intimacy, "I need you to know that whatever circumstances brought you to Cedar Ridge, whatever reasons you have for maintaining privacy about your background, my feelings for you are based on who you are rather than what you might be hiding." "And what feelings are those?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm falling in love with you," Tom admitted, "with your intelligence, your kindness, your genuine character. If you're willing to consider the possibility, I'd like to court you properly, regardless of whatever complications your situation might involve." Miss Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears that seemed to combine joy with profound sadness. "Tom, there are things about my circumstances that you don't understand. Things that might change how you feel about possibilities between us." "Then tell me," Tom encouraged. "Trust me with the truth, and let me decide what I can accept." But before Miss Elizabeth could respond, the sound of raised voices from the hotel lobby interrupted their private moment. Through the suite's windows, Tom could see several well-dressed men who carried themselves with the authority of people accustomed to being obeyed without question. Miss Elizabeth's face went pale as she recognized something about the new arrivals. "They found me," she whispered with the despair of someone whose worst fears were being realized. "Who's found you?" Tom asked. But the answer came in the form of a sharp knock on the suite's door and a voice that carried the unmistakable authority of law enforcement. "Miss Vanderbilt, this is Detective Morrison of the Pinkerton Agency. We need to speak with you immediately." Tom stared at Elizabeth, Miss Vanderbilt, as the implications of the name hit him like a physical blow. Vanderbilt, one of the wealthiest families in America, industrial titans whose fortunes dwarfed the resources of entire states. The mysterious Miss Elizabeth wasn't just from a privileged background. She was one of the most prominent heiresses in the country, and Tom had been falling in love with someone whose social position made their relationship not just unlikely, but virtually impossible. The silence that followed the detective's announcement stretched like a chasm between Tom and the woman he'd known as Miss Elizabeth. She stood frozen beside the hotel window, her face pale with the resignation of someone whose carefully constructed refuge had finally crumbled. Elizabeth Vanderbilt. Tom repeated softly, the weight of the name settling around him like the walls of a prison. You're Elizabeth Vanderbilt. She turned to face him with eyes that held both defiance and desperate hope. Yes, Elizabeth Catherine Vanderbilt, granddaughter of Commodore Vanderbilt, heiress to the Vanderbilt Railroad fortune, and apparently the subject of a nationwide search by my family's hired investigators. The pounding on the door grew more insistent, accompanied by voices that carried the authority of people unaccustomed to being kept waiting. But Tom found himself unable to focus on anything beyond the revelation that the woman he'd fallen in love with possessed wealth and social position that made his feelings seem presumptuous beyond measure. Miss Vanderbilt, came Detective Morrison's voice again. We know you're in there. Your family is concerned for your safety, and we have legal authority to ensure your protection. Elizabeth. Tom couldn't think of her by any other name despite the revelation. Moved toward the door with the bearing of someone preparing to face execution. I suppose there's no point in delaying the inevitable. Wait, Tom said, catching her arm gently. Before you open that door, I need to understand something. Why? Why did you leave your family, your fortune, everything you were born to inherit? Elizabeth's smile was bitter but genuine. Because I wanted to discover who I was when stripped of everything that wealth and social position provide. I wanted to know if anyone could love Elizabeth the person, rather than Elizabeth the fortune. She gestured toward the clay sculpture Tom had created, which sat on the room's writing desk like a testament to possibilities that now seemed impossibly naive. You saw me, Tom. You saw who I really am beneath all the expectations and obligations. You treated me as an equal in conversation, respected my thoughts, and cared about my character rather than my inheritance. And now I return to a world where my value is measured in railroad stock and real estate holdings, where my marriage will be arranged to benefit family business interests, where my thoughts and feelings matter less than my ability to produce socially acceptable heirs. The pain in her voice made Tom's heart ache. But before he could respond, the hotel door opened without permission, revealing 3 men whose expensive clothes and confident bearing marked them as representatives of serious authority. Miss Vanderbilt, said the leader, a tall man with graying hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. I'm Detective Morrison. Your grandfather sent us to ensure your safe return to New York. Elizabeth straightened her shoulders with dignity that reminded Tom of her courage during their first meeting. Detective Morrison, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not a child to be collected and returned against my will. I'm 24 years old and capable of making my own decisions about where and how I live. That may be true in general, Miss Vanderbilt, but your grandfather has reason to believe you've been influenced by unsuitable companions during your absence. Morrison's gaze flicked dismissively toward Tom. Desperate people sometimes target wealthy individuals for purposes of extortion or manipulation. Tom felt heat rise in his cheeks at the implication, but Elizabeth's response was immediate and fierce. Mr. Sullivan has shown me nothing but respect and courtesy. He's a skilled craftsman, an intelligent conversationalist, and a man of genuine character. If you're suggesting he's taken advantage of me in any way, you're both wrong and insulting. Detective Morrison studied Tom with obvious skepticism. Mr. Sullivan, I presume? What exactly is your relationship with Miss Vanderbilt? Miss Elizabeth has been a client of my barbering services, Tom replied carefully, aware that anything he said might be used against both of them. Beyond that, she's become a friend whose company and conversation I value highly. Friend, Morrison repeated with obvious disbelief. Mr. Sullivan, do you have any idea who this woman really is? The extent of her family's wealth and influence? I know she's intelligent, kind, and genuine, Tom answered firmly. Beyond that, I judge people by their character rather than their bank accounts. Elizabeth's expression showed gratitude for his defense, but also resignation about the futility of resistance. Detective Morrison, what exactly does my grandfather require for my return? Immediate departure for New York. where you'll resume your proper place in society and fulfill the marriage arrangement that was finalized during your absence. Marriage arrangement? Elizabeth's voice carried shock and anger. What marriage arrangement? Morrison consulted a document from his coat pocket. Your engagement to Lord Pemberton of England has been formally announced. The wedding is scheduled for next month, combining Vanderbilt business interests with English aristocratic connections that will benefit both families significantly. Tom watched Elizabeth's face transform from shock to fury to something that looked like despair. The woman who'd sought freedom to discover her own identity was being informed that her future had been decided without her consent or participation. I won't do it, Elizabeth said quietly but firmly. I won't marry a stranger for the convenience of business arrangements. Miss Vanderbilt, this matter has progressed beyond personal preference. Legal documents have been signed, financial commitments made, and social announcements published. Your family's reputation and business interests depend on your fulfilling these obligations. Tom felt the situation spiraling beyond anything he could influence or control. Elizabeth was being pulled back into a world where his feelings for her, and possibly her feelings for him, were relevant compared to family expectations and business necessities. Elizabeth, Tom said softly, drawing her attention back to him. What do you want to do? The simple question seemed to surprise everyone in the room, as if Elizabeth's personal desires had been forgotten amid discussions of family obligations and business arrangements. I want to stay here, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I want to continue being Elizabeth rather than Miss Vanderbilt. I want to build something real with someone who sees me as a person rather than an opportunity. Detective Morrison's expression showed the patience of someone dealing with an unreasonable child. Miss Vanderbilt, such romantic notions are understandable but impractical. You have responsibilities that transcend personal desires. And what if I renounce those responsibilities? Elizabeth asked, what if I formally give up my inheritance and claim the family wealth? The suggestion sent shock waves through the room. Morrison stared at her as if she proposed something physically impossible, while Tom realized the magnitude of what Elizabeth was considering. Miss Vanderbilt, you can't be serious. We're discussing one of the largest fortunes in America. Your share of the inheritance represents wealth that most people couldn't imagine possessing. Wealth that comes with obligations I can't accept, Elizabeth replied. Detective Morrison, I need time to consider my options. I'm not leaving Cedar Ridge today. Morrison's expression hardened with the authority of someone unaccustomed to having his instructions questioned. Miss Vanderbilt, I have legal authority to ensure your protection, which includes preventing you from making decisions that clearly aren't in your best interests. Are you arresting me? Elizabeth asked with dangerous calm. I'm ensuring that you return to your family's protection before you do something irreversibly foolish. Tom had heard enough. Detective, with respect, Miss Elizabeth is an adult woman capable of making her own decisions. Unless you're charging her with a crime, you don't have authority to force her to go anywhere. Morrison turned his attention back to Tom with obvious irritation. Mr. Sullivan, you're interfering in matters far beyond your understanding. Miss Vanderbilt's family has resources to make life very difficult for people who complicate their affairs. The threat was subtle but clear, and Tom recognized that his growing relationship with Elizabeth had placed him in conflict with some of the most powerful people in America. But looking at Elizabeth's face, seeing the desperation and hope warring in her expression, Tom knew he couldn't abandon her to face these pressures alone. Elizabeth, he said quietly, whatever you decide, you don't have to face it by yourself. If you want to stay in Cedar Ridge, if you want to build something new here, I'll stand with you regardless of the consequences. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears that seemed to combine gratitude with profound love. But before she could respond, Detective Morrison played what he clearly considered his final card. Miss Vanderbilt, perhaps you should know that your decision affects more than just yourself. Your grandfather's health has been failing during your absence. The stress of your disappearance and the complications it's created for the family business have taken a serious toll on his constitution. The words hit Elizabeth like a physical blow, and Tom watched her resolve crumble under the weight of guilt and family obligation. Whatever feelings she had for him, whatever dreams she'd found in Cedar Ridge, her love for her grandfather was being used as leverage to ensure her compliance. How ill is he? Elizabeth asked in a voice barely above a whisper. Seriously ill. The doctors believe that resolving the situation and seeing you safely married might be his last hope for recovery. Tom realized that Elizabeth was facing an impossible choice: her own happiness and freedom against her grandfather's life and health. The Vanderbilt fortune might be beyond his ability to compete with, but family love was a weapon against which he had no defense. As Elizabeth struggled with the most difficult decision of her life, Tom understood that their brief happiness in Cedar Ridge was ending, regardless of what either of them wanted or hoped for the future. Elizabeth stood in the center of the hotel suite, surrounded by the wreckage of her carefully constructed new life, while three worlds collided with devastating force. The simple barbershop appointments that had become precious opportunities for authentic connection now seemed naive and temporary against the reality of Vanderbilt expectations and family obligations. "I need to speak with Mr. Sullivan privately," Elizabeth said with quiet authority that momentarily surprised Detective Morrison. "Miss Vanderbilt, I don't think." "Detective, I've been compliant with your presence and patient with your demands. I'm asking for 10 minutes of private conversation before I make decisions that will affect the rest of my life." Morrison consulted his pocket watch with obvious reluctance. 10 minutes. But this matter must be resolved today. After the detectives withdrew to the hotel corridor, Elizabeth moved to the window overlooking Cedar Ridge's Main Street, where Tom's barbershop was visible among the collection of buildings that had become her refuge from the expectations of wealth and social position. "Tom," she began, her voice careful and controlled, "I need you to understand something important about the world I come from." When Detective Morrison mentioned my grandfather's health, he wasn't just appealing to my emotions. He was stating a simple fact about how Vanderbilt family dynamics work. Tom joined her at the window, noting how the afternoon light revealed the strain and exhaustion in her features. "What do you mean?" "My grandfather built an empire through will and determination, but he's 78 years old and his health has been declining for months. My disappearance didn't cause his illness, but the stress of family complications and business uncertainties has definitely made it worse." Elizabeth turned to face Tom with an expression that combined love with devastating sadness. "More than that, my absence has created genuine problems for the family's business interests. The Vanderbilt name carries weight in financial markets, and uncertainty about succession and family stability affects stock prices, railroad operations, and thousands of jobs." Tom began to understand the scope of pressures that Elizabeth faced, not just personal obligations to family members, but responsibilities that affected entire industries and countless workers whose livelihoods depended on Vanderbilt business success. And the marriage arrangement? Lord Pemberton represents connections to European shipping interests that could expand Vanderbilt railroad operations internationally. The marriage isn't just social convenience. It's a business alliance that could benefit American trade relationships for generations. Tom felt the weight of these revelations settling around him like chains. Elizabeth wasn't just choosing between personal happiness and family expectations. She was choosing between her own desires and responsibilities that extended far beyond individual concerns. "What do you want to do?" Tom asked, echoing his earlier question despite understanding how much more complicated the answer had become. Elizabeth's smile was filled with love and regret. "I want to stay here with you. I want to marry a man who treats me as an equal, who values my thoughts and character, who creates beautiful art with skilled hands, and sees me as Elizabeth rather than as a Vanderbilt fortune." She gestured toward the clay sculpture that sat on the writing desk, a reminder of conversations and growing affection that now seemed impossibly precious. "These past weeks have been the happiest of my life, Tom. You've shown me what love could feel like when based on respect and genuine affection rather than social convenience. But I can't destroy my grandfather's health, ruin thousands of workers' livelihoods, and damage my family's business empire for the sake of personal happiness. The cost to other people would be too high." Tom understood what Elizabeth was telling him, though every part of his heart rebelled against the logic that would separate them. "So you're returning to New York?" "I have to," Elizabeth whispered, tears flowing freely now. "I have to marry Lord Pemberton, take my place in society, and fulfill the obligations that come with being born at Vanderbilt." Tom pulled her into his arms, holding her close while they both struggled with the reality of circumstances that made their love impossible despite its authenticity and depth. "Elizabeth, I need you to know something," Tom said softly. "What we've shared here, the conversations and feelings and possibilities we discovered, that was real. Whatever happens next, whatever life you return to, what we found together was genuine and valuable. It was the most real thing I've ever experienced," Elizabeth replied, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "You saw me, Tom. You saw who I really am beneath everything else, and you love that person. I'll carry that knowledge with me forever." They held each other until Detective Morrison's sharp knock reminded them that the outside world wouldn't wait for their private grief. When Elizabeth opened the door, her composure had returned, though her eyes remained bright with unshed tears. "Miss Vanderbilt," Morrison said, "have you reached a decision?" "I'll return to New York," Elizabeth replied formally. "I'll fulfill my family obligations and honor the arrangements that have been made." Morrison's relief was obvious. "Excellent. We can depart on this evening's train if you'll gather your belongings." "I have one condition," Elizabeth added with quiet authority. "Mr. Sullivan is not to be contacted, threatened, or bothered in any way because of his association with me. He provided barbering services and friendly conversation. Nothing more. Any suggestion otherwise would be both false and unfair." Morrison nodded agreement. Though his expression suggested he considered Tom fortunate to escape more serious consequences for complicating Vanderbilt family affairs. As Elizabeth gathered her few possessions, Tom realized that their relationship would end as suddenly as it had begun, with polite formality masking deeper emotions that circumstances wouldn't allow them to express or pursue. "Mr. Sullivan," Elizabeth said as she prepared to leave, "thank you for your excellent professional services and for the pleasure of your conversation. I wish you every success with your artistic endeavors." The formal words were necessary for the detective's benefit, but Elizabeth's eyes conveyed everything she couldn't say aloud: love, gratitude, and regret for possibilities that would never be realized. "Miss Elizabeth," Tom replied with equal formality, "it's been an honor to serve you. I hope your travels are safe and your future brings you happiness." As Elizabeth left with her escorts, Tom stood alone in the hotel suite that still carried traces of her presence. The faint scent of expensive perfume, the impression of her form in the chair where she'd sat during their conversations, and the clay sculpture that captured her essence more accurately than any photograph could have managed. Cedar Ridge's main street looked different through the window now, smaller and more limited than it had seemed when Elizabeth's presence had made it feel like the center of possibilities. Tom's barbershop, visible in the distance, seemed to represent a life that was suddenly less meaningful without the prospect of sharing it with someone who understood his aspirations and appreciated his character. But as the afternoon faded into evening and the eastbound train carried Elizabeth back toward her inevitable marriage to Lord Pemberton, Tom found himself grateful for the brief happiness they'd shared rather than bitter about its ending. Some love, he reflected, was too precious to regret even when circumstances made it impossible to sustain. Elizabeth had given him the gift of seeing himself through her eyes, as someone worthy of respect, admiration, and affection. That knowledge would sustain him even if they never met again. The clay sculpture remained on the writing desk, a permanent reminder of conversations that had enriched his understanding of art, love, and the complicated relationship between personal desires and social responsibilities. Tomorrow, Tom would return to his barbershop and resume the life he'd built in Cedar Ridge. But he would never again doubt his own worth or the value of authentic connection between people who saw each other clearly and without pretense. Elizabeth Vanderbilt had given him that gift, and no amount of wealth or social position could diminish its importance. 6 months after Elizabeth's departure, Tom had settled back into the rhythm of small-town life when outward calm that masked the profound changes her presence had created in his understanding of love and possibility. His barbershop remained Cedar Ridge's social center. His artistic work continued developing, and his reputation for skilled craftsmanship and honest conversation kept him prosperous and respected. But the clay sculpture of Elizabeth remained on his workbench at home, a reminder of conversations that had expanded his horizons and feelings that had revealed depth of emotion he hadn't known he possessed. Cedar Ridge felt smaller now, though Tom wasn't sure whether that was because Elizabeth had opened his mind to larger possibilities or because her absence had simply diminished the world's capacity for joy. "You've been different since that Eastern lady left," observed Sheriff Mackenzie during his regular Tuesday appointment. the same time slot that Elizabeth's visits had once filled. Quieter, more thoughtful. She made quite an impression. Tom carefully trimmed the sheriff's sideburns while considering how much of the truth he could share without betraying Elizabeth's confidence. She was good company, Sheriff. Intelligent conversation and genuine interest in local life. You don't meet people like that every day. Word around town is that she was someone important back east. Rich family, from what folks heard when those detective fellows came through asking questions. Rich or poor, she was a good person. Tom replied simply, "That's what matters." But Sheriff Mackenzie's casual observation reminded Tom of how thoroughly Elizabeth had concealed her true identity from Cedar Ridge's residents. To them, she'd been simply Miss Elizabeth, a traveling woman who required barbering services for mysterious reasons. Only Tom knew the full scope of what she'd given up by returning to her family obligations. The morning mail brought an unexpected letter with Tom's name written in elegant handwriting that made his heart race with recognition. Elizabeth's letter had been posted from New York 3 weeks earlier, and its very existence proved she'd been thinking of their time together despite the new life she'd been forced to resume. "Dear Tom," the letter began, "I hope this finds you well and that your artistic work continues flourishing. I wanted you to know that I think of Cedar Ridge often and of conversations that brought me more happiness than I thought possible to find." Tom read the careful words that managed to convey deep feeling while remaining appropriate for correspondence that might be monitored by family members or social obligations. New York society has welcomed me back with the enthusiasm reserved for prodigal daughters who finally accepted their proper responsibilities. My engagement to Lord Pemberton was celebrated with parties that felt more like business meetings, and our wedding preparations proceed with the efficiency of a corporate merger. The dry humor in her description couldn't mask the sadness that Tom could read between the lines. Elizabeth was fulfilling her family duties, but at the cost of personal happiness and authentic connection. I wanted you to know that our conversations helped me understand something important about the difference between duty and imprisonment. While I must honor my family obligations, I refuse to surrender the insights about authentic living that Cedar Ridge taught me. Tom continued reading with growing amazement as Elizabeth outlined decisions she'd made about her future within the constraints of Vanderbilt expectations. Lord Pemberton, fortunately, proves to be a reasonable man who married for business advantage rather than romantic attachment. We've agreed that our union will be a partnership of mutual respect rather than a traditional Victorian marriage. I'll fulfill my social obligations while maintaining independence to pursue interests that matter to me personally. The letter continued with news that made Tom's heart soar with pride and possibility. More importantly, I've convinced my grandfather to establish an arts foundation that will provide funding for talented artists in frontier communities. I described your sculpture and artistic vision so enthusiastically that he's agreed to offer you a commission to create works that capture the spirit of American frontier life. Tom stared at the words, hardly daring to believe what Elizabeth was proposing. The commission will provide funding for 2 years of artistic development, along with access to materials, instruction, and exhibition opportunities that could establish your reputation nationally. You would work independently, in Cedar Ridge or wherever you choose, with only the requirement that your final pieces reflect the authentic frontier experience that shaped both your artistic vision and your character. The offer was beyond anything Tom had imagined possible. The opportunity to pursue his artistic dreams with financial security and professional support that could transform his entire future. But the letter's final paragraph revealed Elizabeth's deeper motivation for the generous offer. "Tom, I can't offer you my heart because circumstances have claimed it for purposes beyond personal choice. But I can offer you the opportunity to share your remarkable talent with the world, to create beauty that will outlast all of us, and to know that someone who loves you believes absolutely in your worth and potential." The letter was signed simply Elizabeth, but Tom understood that it represented more than professional opportunity. It was a declaration of love expressed through the one gift she was free to give. 2 weeks later, Tom received official correspondence from the Vanderbilt Arts Foundation, confirming Elizabeth's commission along with practical details about funding, materials, and exhibition arrangements. The opportunity would indeed transform his life, though not in ways that would bring him and Elizabeth together. As Tom prepared to accept the commission and begin the artistic work that Elizabeth's love had made possible, he realized that their relationship had achieved something more lasting than conventional romance. She'd recognized its potential and used her resources to ensure its development, while he'd given her the gift of seeing herself as valuable beyond her family's wealth and expectations. On a crisp autumn morning 6 months after Elizabeth's departure, Tom stood in his barber shop, reading a newspaper account of her wedding to Lord Pemberton. The ceremony had been magnificent, attended by hundreds of guests representing American business interests and European aristocracy. The photograph accompanying the article showed Elizabeth in an elaborate wedding dress, standing beside a tall, distinguished man who carried himself with the confidence of someone comfortable with wealth and privilege. But Tom's trained eye could see what the newspaper photographer had missed: the careful composure that masked Elizabeth's true feelings about the life she'd accepted. That evening, Tom began work on the first sculpture for Elizabeth's commission, a piece that would capture not her physical appearance, but the essence of someone who'd chosen duty over desire while maintaining integrity that made such sacrifice meaningful rather than merely tragic. As he shaped clay into forms that honored both love and loss, Tom understood that Elizabeth had been right about the difference between duty and imprisonment. She'd accepted obligations that came with her birth and circumstances, but she'd refused to surrender the authentic self that their conversations had revealed and nurtured. Their love story wouldn't end with marriage or conventional happiness, but it had created something more enduring: artistic expression that would celebrate the beauty of authentic connection, and the knowledge that real love sometimes expresses itself through sacrifice rather than possession. Years later, when Tom's sculptures were exhibited in galleries from San Francisco to New York, critics would praise his ability to capture the human spirit under pressure, the dignity of people facing impossible choices, and the beauty that emerged when character transcended circumstances. Elizabeth would attend every exhibition, accompanied by Lord Pemberton, who'd grown to respect his wife's intelligence and independence while benefiting from her business insights and social skills. She would study Tom's work with the appreciation of someone who understood its deeper meanings, and occasionally their eyes would meet across crowded gallery spaces with recognition of shared memories and continuing affection. But they would never speak privately again, both understanding that their brief time in Cedar Ridge had given them everything that was possible between people whose love was real, but whose circumstances made it impossible to sustain. The small-town barber and the wealthy heiress had created something beautiful together, not the conventional romance that circumstances prevented, but an understanding of authentic love that enriched both their lives and inspired art that would outlast the social expectations that had separated them. In the end, Tom reflected as he continued creating sculptures that celebrated the human capacity for love, sacrifice, and nobility. Some connections transcend the boundaries that seem to define them. Elizabeth would always be part of his artistic vision, while he would always represent her truest understanding of what love could be when based on respect, equality, and genuine appreciation for character over circumstance. Their love story had been brief but transformative, proving that the most meaningful connections often exist beyond the conventional boundaries that society recognizes, creating beauty that endures long after the circumstances that inspired have passed into memory.